Okay, I think it's wonderful. There we go. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about um, some of the components of leadership and sustainability by Michael Fullan and what we've got so far with our handout and all that. So, I
Great.
don't.
So I, as a higher education member, I found the book very interesting. One of the reasons I chose the book specifically is because it said you could take the lessons learned to other areas. And I can see that, but since you guys are K through 12, I kind of wondered how you felt about it because a lot of his examples were specifically K through 12.
I really like there's a great quote that addresses that of the longer term sustainable reform requires the deep ownership of teachers and principals. That's on page 59 at the bottom. Um, I thought it was really interesting how he really focused on the ownership piece of the teacher and student, or the teacher and other administrators buying in, and how to get that ownership from them by taking a look at the different components, especially those 8 key things that are really addressed throughout the book. But taking a look at those, and if those are in place, that's when you can start to have that sustainability.
Mhm.
Yeah, I agree. I think for me personally, uh, I really liked how he discussed the component of trying things even if they're not successful all the time, because the only way you're going to learn uh, if something works is by failing at it and then changing it and continuing to go back and look at it and say, "Oh, this didn't work. Let's try something new." And what we learned from this was, that this component of this worked, but maybe we can change it to where it can be even better. And I think that's one of the keys to sustainability is continuing to look back and say, okay, is this working? Is it still working for the culture that we have now? And I think, especially in K-12, a lot of times we don't go back and revisit the same thing we've been doing over and over. Well, some things that we've put in place for so long, standardized from student testing to busing all over, in the cities, outside the city. It may not be the best practice anymore. We need to revisit things like that. So I really liked that component, and I liked how he said it's okay to fail, and the highest success is the people that fail the most often. Then you to do that. So I like that a lot.
I found his example in the first chapter where he talked about the school system that was in trouble and all the changes that they had made. I found that very interesting. I don't have a lot of experience with that, again, because of higher ed, but I think that's probably true. People try to put out fires in the short term, and we even do that in higher ed, but to be proactive and try to sustain your changes and move forward and continually improve, which is essentially, I thought, what the book was about. It was very interesting. I would have liked to have seen, I guess for me personally, I would have liked to have seen a little more, outside examples other than K through 12, but um, I kind of enjoyed it. I thought it was very interesting. He has some very, very good ideas. Very lofty for the most part, but good ideas. I think the leadership ideas, not just the structure, because really in higher ed the structure is a little different than K through 12. You don't have the state and the system. You don't have the different leaders really and truly there, and we don't have to answer to parents where you guys have to do that. But there's a lot of good points about leadership and being dynamic and really planning for the long term. I think for me that was the overall message.
Definitely, the idea of building a coalition of leaders was really evident throughout this book. I found it really interesting that there was the focus on not just leaders as like the administrators, but leaders as teachers, and how building the capacity, once that's built, then you can really start to work together. That's when you can feel like more of it as a team, and people are more willing to feel invested, and that buy-in is there, so that then they can really move forward and then sustain whatever is being built up.
I mean, I think and you may want to remind me. I think I'm getting a little bit of feedback in yours. I think it's on the top. There you go. Cool. I think it's interesting to hear someone who's not in K-12 talk about it and how it applies to higher ed, because it's something I'm interested in going into eventually is how it applies to higher education, and we do have to deal a lot with parents in K-12 and a lot of different situations that higher education you may not deal with as much. But I do like how on page 26 they talk about changing from the old paradigm to the new language, managing time versus managing energy, avoid stress versus seeking stress, life is a marathon versus life is a series of sprints, downtime is wasted versus downtime is productive time, rewards fuel performance versus performance fuels, or purpose fuels performance. And I think that was interesting. I really kind of reflected on that for a minute, and how a lot of time we focus on just trying to get this done and trying to meet that next thing, and not so much focusing on, okay, where are we, not so much how much time we're spending on something, but where's our energy focus. And we spend so much time in K-12 focusing our energy on this data-driven, where we don't actually spend the time saying, hey, we're spending so much energy looking at how students are doing on these standardized tests, but we're not actually assessing, are they actually learning anything? Are they actually taking this and pushing it forward into their careers, into their college readiness? Especially for me when I'm teaching chemistry, I can look at the data all day long and be like, oh yeah, this kid made a 90% on my exam, but if they can't take that information and push it forward into biology or physics and into their problem-solving skills, then what have I really done in terms of preparing them for life outside of my classroom? And that's the question, and what they're talking about a lot in this book is, and I think what the author is really referencing is the fact that, okay, how can we continue to sustain growth and learning? And instead of just giving kids this rote memorization, I think more and more teachers are beginning to realize that the more and more we move forward, that the data-driven society that we have right now in terms of public education is not going to continue to sustain itself, because it's just not going to continue to work. Kids are going to get frustrated that they're not learning something. They're going to get to college unprepared, and then teachers are going to begin to realize, hey, these kids are not focused on what really matters in terms of their learning, or teachers, not students. Sorry about that. But yeah, that's kind of something big I got out of it.
I think sometimes that change and that shift in thinking is resisted a lot because of what the authors refer to as this negative energy. And when teachers resist so much, there becomes so much negative energy around any kind of change that's trying to take place, that then you have, I'm not sure if it's this book or another book I'm reading, you have this poison within the organization. And then this poison spreads, and all of a sudden you have a bunch of teachers who don't want to do something. That becomes this huge roadblock, and it becomes impossible to sustain anything because teachers are so resistant to whatever you put in front of them.
I think resistance really comes across on many levels. I don't think it's just K through 12. I think for us in higher ed, it's retention and changing the way that we do business with students, changing the way that our departments are organized. That causes a lot of resistance within everyone who's there. So I think there's resistance all the way around, and I can see that. And we do have lots of students here, and we get lots of students at the university that are not prepared to come to school. I mean, everyone, and I don't know this. People say they teach to pass the exams. Like in Ohio, it's the Ohio Graduate Test. I don't know what it is where you guys are, but they specifically teach to pass those exams. But students aren't comprehending. They're not able to critically think when they come to college. And we find a lot of students that need remedial skills and that need to be taught critical thinking skills when they get to college, because all they've been taught in high school is how to pass these exams, because Essentially, that's what you guys are being graded on.
And I'm sorry, and I think one of the main elements um, in terms of deep learning that they were talking about was using a variety of different types of data to analyze what's going on, not just in in terms of public education, but everything. And it really hit me because I was like, man, if we could look at qualitative and the quantitative data that's coming out of these classrooms and try and determine, okay, what are students really learning? How are we assessing teachers in terms of their understanding? And that's a big push in terms of teacher assessment now is student data, qualitative data, and student feedback about what they learned, not just necessarily what their scores are on the standardized test. So I think that's a big point about sustainability and leadership is, okay, let's look at not just this quantitative data, but try and push other data collection methods, try and look at things from different angles. And I think this even ties into Dr. Bjork's class last year in terms of looking at things through different windows or different points of view to try and see what is the best solution to the problem. And in terms of these 8 elements for leadership, in terms of deep understanding and short-term versus long-term goals, I definitely think that the best leader is someone who could take all of them and put them all together. So there you go.
Should we dive a little bit deeper into each of these eight things, 8 elements of sustainability? You just have a conversation about like each one.
Yeah, that sounds great. If you want to, we can start on that. Sounds good.
All right. So the first one, public service with a moral purpose. I feel like this was a big mouthful, looking at everything that's involved in here. But basically saying that when you can increase the quality of the service, increase the level of the service, then the public service will also then increase. Anything else to add on that one?
But, I mean, you really have to find somebody with those objectives, right? And that's the hard part of all of it. It's finding those leaders that come forward with a moral purpose to affect change within the system. I think you find that everywhere, regardless whether you're in K through 12 or higher ed. Some people want to be along for the ride, and some people, they're just not interested.
And even though you may have a great leader that has all of these things, it's not necessarily that you're going to find followers that want to follow, especially if they're coming off of having maybe a leader that wasn't so great. Then it's going to take them a while to build up that trust so that they can be at a point where they can actually feel comfortable with them. Which kind of leads into number 2, which is commitment to changing context at all levels, which is really focusing on that change. And I really like where it says if you want to change people's behavior, you need to create a community around them where these new beliefs could be practical, expressed, and nurtured. That's on page 17. So creating that community takes time. You're saying that you want to change people's behavior so that they can then change, whether it be in their classroom or wherever in the school environment, but creating that culture of change, creating a place where teachers can feel comfortable and express their thoughts, whatever it may be. It's important to remember that takes time, and I think that the authors did a nice job of explaining that.
Well, I think especially in terms of application where I am right now in Jefferson County, we have the context where students are coming in and the learning environments they're coming from in terms of their home lives, in their communities. There's all these kids from, the median income and the focus of, what's important at home compared to when they get with all these other kids in the middle of, the courtyard are completely different because we have clashing communities, kids that are coming in from different places, west side and east side, and kids that have 170, their median household income is $170,000 a year versus $17,000 a year. And we're expecting these kids to not have differences in culture. We expect they all come in with the same background knowledge. They all come in with the same experiences. When it's just not true. It's impossible that that's the case. And so one of the big things that I took from this in terms of leadership, in terms of my own practice, in terms of what I would do in cases like I'm situated in here, is and take into account the fact that these communities where these kids are coming from and where everybody comes from has to play a role into the decisions that I'm making, because if not, there's going to be this huge clash, and there will never be a place where they can collaborate together until we start to take into account, okay, let's try and build in their community somehow, all of them. How can we find a way to incorporate their community and everyone else's community in the same time, and instead of just expecting that it's not going to play a role at all.
And that seems like a missing puzzle piece, because we see that we have our demographics at our university. We see where the students come from. We see what their background is. We see what their ACT scores are, how they perform on tests, things like that. So we see that data too, but there's a huge disparity between those students that are coming in with lower incomes, big city, and the higher middle class or middle higher class student that's more prepared. Ethnicity for us has a great deal to do with our students that are coming in. Black students are less prepared than white students, and I'm sure that has to do with like the school system that they come from in the inner city and things like that.
So the next element is the lateral capacity building through networks, which I found really fascinating. This focus on learning from your peers. But I almost see these 8 as almost like a hierarchy. So if the leader is doing what they're supposed to and they have that moral purpose and they've set up this culture where people feel comfortable and they've changed the behavior of people, then they can get to this point of being able to learn from each other. I feel like without those first 2, it would be really difficult for teachers to say, okay, I can learn from the teacher that's next door to me. I've heard of a lot of schools, not mine, thankfully, but schools where teachers are kind of just, in their own rooms and not really wanting to learn from someone else. And there's always like this competition of like, who's the best teacher, who has the best ideas, and things like that, where they're not wanting to learn from their peers, which would just make for a really difficult learning environment. But I think the students pick up on that too. So bringing this back to the students and thinking about how they might kind of feel like they're stuck in their room and not really collaborating with other kids.
And one of the things that I really took from that was the part of the book where he talks about collaboration versus collaboration, and I thought that was hilarious. I was like, absolutely, because we actually had a PLC meeting today for chemistry, and I said, look, we've got this one topic. It says chemical reactions. And underneath that it says 7 weeks to teach this topic. And I said, 7 weeks is a really long time. I said, I don't know what you're going to be doing at week 2 and what I'm going to be doing at week 2. So why don't we, try and be more specific? Let's break it down by week as opposed to, 7 weeks. So let's try and break it down by, every 2 or 3 days. What are you going to be doing? What am I going to be doing? So that way we can compare data. And one of the teachers said no. And I said, okay, what do you mean by no? And she said, well, I want my teaching freedom. I want to be able to teach what I want to teach. And I looked at her and I said, well, then that's fine that you want to teach what you want to teach, but is there not some way that we can communicate with one another to try and collaborate so that way I know if what I teach on that subject is similar to you and how our students compare to one another and whether it's good practice, whether they're actually learning the content. I mean, is there not some way we can work on that? And she was like, no, I don't want to risk my freedom of teaching to narrow it into this window because I want to, go with the flow. And I was like, well, then collaboration goes out the window. There's no point in us working on trying to talk about this stuff. So it was really frustrating because it was kind of like what you were talking about earlier in terms of the energy, and I know we'll talk about this in a little while in terms of those people who absorb that energy and people who build it up, and it was kind of like, I was just like, well, fine, forget about it, screw it. I don't, I'm not going to try and collaborate when there's no way for us to work together and for me to know what you're doing. if you're not open to, share your information with me and tell me, what's working for you, what you're going to be teaching in the next 2 or 3 days, or compared to the next 7 weeks, it's just impossible. So it was kind of frustrating, and it became a collaboration. We were just sitting there talking about nothing because we weren't collaborating on stuff. So it was frustrating.
Yeah, I think I guess when I had, gone through this book and highlighted, I highlighted the term that people learn best from peers, right? So, and that's constant, whether you're in higher ed, business, government, whoever is doing a really good job and and been identified as doing a really good job, especially in the teaching profession. I guess the key would be that have some sort of formal structure where the person, the peer that was doing the great work could, really help the other teachers. I don't know if you guys have that.
The way my school is designed is a mentoring model. So there's one certified teacher in the classroom and then two other teachers that are working towards their certification. So it really is a super supportive environment where I don't want to say your hand is held because it's not that way at all, but it is really the more experienced teacher is guiding the other two teachers through, and you're expected to do that. It's part of your job description, and you're trained on how to mentor, you're trained on how to give feedback. But in addition to that, then all of the lead teachers also collaborate. So things like running a field trip, you wouldn't just be thrown in and said, all right, go run your first field trip. The first time you do a field trip, you would run it with a lead teacher. And the next time you would run it, you might be working with a lead teacher, but you would take the lead on it. Then your final time you run a field trip, you would be running it on your own. So it's this kind of this gradual release, but you are learning from your peers the whole time.
Yeah, here it's a little different. It's kind of the opposite. There's just endless freedom to do what you want to do. There's not a lot of you know coming into the classroom. There are if you had teach an end of course class where there's an assessment that they give you in terms of the state. But with chemistry, for me, they only assess biology here at the junior level. So in terms of chemistry, there's no one to assess, how I'm doing. No one in the classroom coming into, they do. The AP comes in, once or twice a year, and to assess me on teaching, and that's it. So it's kind of it's a different thing, and I think this really ties in. If you're okay to go on to step to the fourth element, which is that intelligent accountability, which Fullan talks about. And the fact that doesn't need to be lateral communication with PLCs, because clearly as I mentioned before, the PLC here there's not a lot of collaboration going on, but on top of that there's not that vertical assessment, and it's not adequate. It leads to a lot of drift, and there's a lot of teachers who are just like, well, I'll go in and do what I want to do because no one's going to assess me on what I'm doing anyway. I've got my PLC, but they may not be involved in what I'm doing, and then I don't have assessment from the state, I don't have assessment from the district, I don't even have assessment at my school. So I think what I do is best practice because there's no one there to tell me otherwise, which is really frustrating for me as a new teacher because this is only my second year teaching at the high school level, and there's no one in there telling me how to improve. So my second year, I assume that everything I'm doing is best practice when I know for certain that it's not, because I'm a human being and I make mistakes. And that's really frustrating because I would love for someone to come in and tell me, critically, in a positive way, hey, look, you've been there, but there are things in this that I've seen other teachers do, considering that I've been in this business longer than you have, that is a much better way to improve student learning, to get the kids engaged in what you're doing. I mean, and so it's really frustrating for me that there's not someone there to kind of show me, based upon their background, the fact that they've been spent more time in the classroom and seeing other people in good practice than I have, and so it's kind of just one of those things that ties into intelligent assessment. How can we assess to increase sustainability, and how can leaders come in and improve what people are doing without tearing them down and without just letting them go off on their own and do their own thing every day.
Right. So goes back to leadership at the school level, right? You need obviously a little bit better leadership at where you're at, and Sarah's got some really great leadership at her school. But it talks about, the book talks about too much balance of accountability, or too much intrusion demotivates people, too little permits drift, right? So there's a fine line between all that.
Absolutely, and I think sometimes when people first come to our school, they feel really overwhelmed by the amount of support they get, and at first they kind of think like, oh, I got this, like I can be fine without all of your support. I'll be fine writing lesson plans and, implementing IEPs, and then about a month in, they kind of take that step back of, oh, actually, I do need some help, and it would be nice if someone would kind of guide me through. So it's interesting to watch the teacher attitudes change. Because at first some of them come in really confident, they're coming right off of student teaching in undergrad, and then they're kind of like, oh, actually I do want your help. But it is interesting, that fine line that you talk about is sometimes overwhelming for people, the amount of support that they get and the amount of feedback that they get, because the system that's set up is done well, and the system that was put in place because there's a lot of research backing it. But ultimately, the teachers, it's just interesting to watch how they change, because they want to be held accountable, but then they don't want to be. It's interesting.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I think that there is a fine line, and that's something that I see at other schools where in Jefferson County, it's the other extreme. That they're assessed to the point where they just burn out because they have so many different assessments that they're assessed on. And it's even not intelligent assessment like they're talking about. It's not like something that someone's looking at and focusing on. The parts of it that are actually going to improve student learning and good practice. It's just running through the motions. It's just assessment of you, but there's no real way of giving you information back to help you improve. So I wouldn't even call it intelligent assessment. The other extreme, getting so much on people in terms of vertical assessment. So I don't know if you want to move on to deep learning. And that's one of the things I think that it kind of ties into that assessment too. A lot of teachers are scared of assessment because they're afraid of that failure, and a lot of teachers are afraid. I don't want someone walking in my room because I don't want them to see that I don't really know my content, or that I don't really know how to talk to students, or my classroom management is not that great. And so I don't know if that leads a lot of teachers to not want that information about their teaching practice. But that was something I really enjoyed about the text, was just the fact that, and I really like the quote, "Whoever makes the most mistakes wins." And I'm actually going to put that on my wall for my students next year, so they understand. I mean, there's just this stigma in our society, I think, in some points, especially in education, that you don't want to promote failure. You want students to always feel like they're successful. You always want them to feel like they are doing the perfect job. They're doing, they're 4.0, they're valedictorians, they're the highest honors. And when in all actuality, the reason they are in school is so they can learn, from the fact that they don't know everything. And that's what's so frustrating to me, is that we don't promote failure. We don't promote the fact that, hey, look, you're going to make mistakes, and that's good that you do, because the more and more mistakes you make, the more and more opportunities you have to correct yourself and get it right. And the best kids are the kids that make more mistakes than anybody else, and that's a different thought process than I've ever thought before. I'm still in the stigma of, I hate when people tell me that I'm doing something wrong. It something inside of me like cringes when someone critiques me or tells me that something I'm doing needs to be improved. But it's the only way that we truly we build, that we grow, is by someone getting the weeds off, so that we can truly I don't know if that's a gardening analogy, but I hope you like it. But not holding us back. Those things that are not allowing us to really flourish and move forward, pruning us and making us better. So
That has to start with the leaders, right? So if the leaders aren't being accepting of getting the feedback, or if they can't show that they're also learning. I think the authors really, Fullan really stressed that it's about learning and showing at all levels. So whether it's local, state, district, whatever it is, everyone's invested in the learning. It's not just the teachers that are learning, it's the administrators. And when they're learning, they're constantly making changes to whatever needs a change because of what they've learned. So that constant idea of change, but really with the foundation of learning.
Yeah, everybody, I guess it's such a dynamic environment, K through 12 and higher ed. I mean, you constantly have to evolve and evolve all of your methods and figure out what you're doing wrong, what you're doing right, and you learn from those mistakes. The text says fear causes a focus on the short run, and fear creates a focus on the individual rather than the collective. So everybody's afraid that all the blame and fear is going to fall solely on their shoulders. So when you have fear, it goes to one person. Everybody likes to blame one person instead of the system at large and the failures within the system.
So let's talk about then maybe this idea of the short-term and long-term goals, because this is something I feel that is really a focus in leadership right now, is the fact that we want these short-term fixes. We want things that are going to happen quickly, and that was something that I know the author talks about. There are ways of doing things short-term, but it has to lead to long-term goals. It's not just a quick fix. There are things that you can do in the short term, and there are ways that you can measure things in the short term to show growth. And she gives pieces of data for reading and for literacy. Sorry, he said she. My apologies. But the author, Mike Fullan, male, talks about how you can have these quick fixes and you can have this short-term goal, but it has to lead to something that's sustainable for the long term. If you're talking about data analysis and you say, look at this growth that we've had, and that's a big thing here in Jefferson County too, is like these schools that are lower performing, they've jumped up from from 30% in reading to 80% in reading. But how can we continue to sustain that in a way that doesn't lead teachers to burn out? Because you got teachers who are coming into the classroom and staying there until 4:30 in the afternoon tutoring students, and you can't do that. You can't sustain that. So how can leaders look back on that? And I think that's that cyclical idea of, okay, how can you've seen different elements of things that work. How can you continue to go back and look at that and say, okay, what were parts of it that worked that we can use, but in ways that are sustainable for the long term?
I think that's where we see a lot of districts, at least around here, they're trying to put in short-term fixes, especially with the budget. So I've probably the last 5 years, it seems like a district every single year is in the news for they'll put in some kind of a quick fix, or they'll use some short-term funding to, keep more teachers and not have as many layoffs. And then the next year they're cutting, 75 teachers, and there's a big uproar, and everyone's talking about how they'll, pay more with their taxes or whatever it may be. But those short-term fixes then aren't looking long-term, and there just ends up being more problems, which is what leads to this idea of sustainability.
Reactive and proactive are two of my favorite terms, and I use them all the time. And higher ed, it seems like at least our institution and lots of K through 12 institutions are in a mode of reactive, whether it's internal or external constituencies that they react to. We try to get to the proactive state where we're planning more for the long term, but it's so hard to get there. I think districts K through 12 has the same problem because you're constantly faced with all these issues coming down from the state and parents and district, and you just react to them constantly, and you try to make these short-term changes, but you never really have the energy or the focus to get to the long-term stuff.
And I like that you brought up the fact that there's you're losing that energy, and that's that kind of ties to the next element in terms of continuing to cycle back and re-energizing the people in the system by saying we've got to find some way of going back and reinfusing those things that are working because if we don't, people are going to burn out so quickly. And that's that cyclical energizing element that he talks about in terms of don't focus so much on these things that aren't working. Don't focus so much on trying to get these quick fixes because you're going to burn out. You're going to run out of energy, and it's not going to work anymore. And I like the discussion that it's kind of a new idea in terms of the fact that focusing on what people are doing it as opposed to the end goal of just getting that assessment and getting them to get those grades. Focus on, okay, how much energy are we putting towards this? I mean, if there's a new assessment for teachers that's coming out that administrators are going to put into place, and leadership is saying, yeah, we need to do this, let's do it right now because we'll be able to assess teachers so much quickly. But look at how much time and energy are you spending with your administrators doing all that? How much focus then can they put towards classroom conduct and student discipline and suspension rates and things of that nature because they spend so much energy on going and observing teachers every day. There's not that's never been a discussion in terms of the new standards that are coming out here in a little while. Is okay, well, how much energy are we actually putting towards this, and is it sustainable? I mean, it's going to be great the first year. I mean, sure, we can definitely get some good information, but is that information we're going to be able to get next year and the year after that? Is this a plan that's going to last for 5 years or 1 year? I mean, how much energy is it going to take?
I think teachers stop listening after so many either failed attempts or just they start to get burned out and tired of listening to all these new changes that are going to take place. And it becomes this idea of the teachers can't sustain, even though the administrators might be gung-ho of, this is our plan, this is what we're doing, but the teachers just kind of fall off the radar of, I'm not going to listen to this, I don't want to invest my energy in it because they see how exhausted the administrators are with it.
So can we talk about number 8, the long lever of leadership? Are you guys ready to move on to that? I guess the point that I had highlighted in this part of the book is the main work of the leaders is to help put into place the 8 elements of sustainability, all 8 simultaneously feeding on each other. And to do that, we need a system laced with leaders who are trained to think in bigger terms and to act in ways that affect larger parts of the system as a whole. The new theoreticians, right? Which is kind of what our poster was about, the new leaders. And how do you find those people on all of those different levels that work together? Fullan says it's difficult. It's difficult to get there. It's difficult to do. How do you put everything together and find the right leaders to make a difference in this realm?
One of the things that was kind of interesting to me was that the author said this is something that's never been done before. And I was kind of like, oh, well, great. So this is an idea that's never worked in the past up until this point. But I think for me the big takeaway is capacity building. Thinking outside the box. And I think that's one of the problems that we have here in Jefferson County is that we are so in our shell. We don't want to. If a practice is working, we're like, oh yeah, good job, great job. And you don't look back and say, okay, well, how can we push this out? How can we sustain this by taking this practice that the school is doing and sharing it with other schools? Not only other schools, but other districts. Not other districts, but other states. I mean, geez, if something's working, don't just put it in in your nice little treasure box of goodness and leave it alone. I mean, share it out. I mean, build the capacity of these people and give them people to share out with and say, okay, this is what's working for us, and let's build on that. I mean, I had someone the other day I was calling about they had a new automated system for taking attendance, and I thought this is a great idea, and so I called up the manufacturer and I said, hey, I'm really interested in using this in our school, and he says, oh, well, why don't you just call Fern Creek? They've been using this for the last year, and I said, how in the world? Why wouldn't someone share that? And so I can know if it's working. And the fact that we close the doors of education so much that it's hard to know what's working for other people and know what best practice is. And I don't understand why leaders can't take and build upon what other people are doing that works. I mean, everybody's just trying to reinvent the wheel so often because they think they have the best method, I feel. And they just can't look out and say, okay, how can I learn from what other people are doing? And not just that, how can I take what I'm doing and sustain it by getting the support of the people around me, the other people in the district, the other people in the state, by sharing out what I'm doing. So that was kind of the big takeaway for me was, build upon the work that you're doing by sharing it out with others and having them support you. It's kind of like that kid who wants to go to school, share out with your friends and family so they can give you money to continue to sustain yourself. So anyway, that's kind of what it's up.
So without these 8 elements, sustainability rather difficult and probably not happen. And Fullan recommends that all 8 of these are in place in order to have success at the state, district, or local level. And then our handout will address all of these things and hopefully provide a nice graphic for remembering them, keeping them in mind.
Great book. I thought it was a great team. I enjoy working with both of you. And it'll be interesting to see how we integrate with the other groups, because I know that's our next project. And we come up with our definitions of leadership in higher ed. So I guess we're on to, after we finish our poster, we're on to the next task.
All right, sounds good, guys. I'll wrap this up and put in a nice little package email, I think, and we'll be good to go. So, all right, we'll continue working on the handout and we'll go from there. Thanks, guys.